Well, good morning. Atheists, agnostics, skeptics, free thinkers, whatever you like to call yourself, you are welcome here. At Seattle Atheist Church, we call ourselves an atheist church because you will never hear anything supernatural talked about from the podium. So today we're going to be talking specifically about this book, A Manual for Creating Atheists. So I loved and I hated this book. And I don't usually have that kind of experience. It's complicated. I'm a little disappointed because I wanted this to be a book that not only could I enjoy, but that perhaps friends and family who were curious about atheism that I could recommend. And I don't feel like it is that, for a couple of reasons. So the first is, very oddly, Peter Boghossian refuses to call himself an atheist. Because, an atheist is a lack of belief in anything, and so he doesn't call himself an anti-leprechaunist, for example. And yet, the entire book is about him talking about how everywhere he goes, when he's in the line at the grocery store, or even when he flies, he tries to fly where there's no assigned seating, and then sit in the middle, or maybe look for people who are reading religious literature so that he can talk to them about their faith and kind of deconvert them. So it seems odd to me that a person with that much zeal for what I would consider atheist activity refuses to call himself an atheist. So it's a bit odd. And so most of the book, in the beginning of the book, what he talks about is don't try to talk people out of their faith. Don't try to talk them out of any specific beliefs in God or Jesus or anything, and do not try to use facts to persuade them. For example, that the Bible, it's not called storm history, basically creationist history. They have a name for it. Flood history, right? They don't try to convince them that flood history is inaccurate because facts didn't get them to this place, and so facts aren't going to get them out of this place. But what you should do if you want to be what he calls a street epistemologist, that is a person who can work with other people and help disabuse them of their faith, is that what you really want to do is you want to call into question believing in things that you don't have good reason to believe. You want to call into question the idea that believing things on faith is a good thing to do, right? And so, first of all, just whatever the person's claim is, then we step back from it and we say, when they finally say, well, I believe it because I just feel it, or I just know it, or I believe it based on faith, then you want to start working with that and actually make the conversation be about believing things based on faith rather than on reason. So one of the things that I did not like about this book is that he talks about helping people lose their faith, but he talks about them as if they are infected with a virus. And this is the kind of thing that if you gave this book to somebody who is a faithful person, it's just like creates so much, the walls go up. Even I was having a really hard time, I'm moaning and groaning as I'm reading this, okay? And that basically comes from the Dawkins idea that memes can even be, beliefs can be memes, and they pass from person to person, and the memes that take hold are the memes that survive, right? So he's trying to cure people of the infection of believing things that they have no good reason to believe. I wish that he had just simply talked about that, and in fact we had a talk that I thought was really good on Dawkins' meme theory, and I tried to come up with some atheist memes that we could spread in the culture to kind of combat the Christian memes in the culture. So that probably we'll come back around and do that at some point in the future. But basically, the first half of the book is him talking to different people, and then when they tell him why they have their faith, he pinpoints their main idea and says, okay, so that's your thesis, now let's work with that thesis. And so one of the things that had struck me, if you want to be a street epistemologist, is that most of us, that's not how we are trained to think, let alone to have conversations. Now, there are a few philosophers in the audience, but most of us, when somebody tells us something, we don't say, okay, so it seems to me that your thesis is this, now let's examine your evidence for that, right? So one good training would simply be to start thinking more like a philosopher. And we are going to continue to work with the idea of critical thinking as a skill. It doesn't necessarily come naturally, and how can we all develop critical thinking so that we can be better street epistemologists. Okay, one last thing is what I really did love about this book, though, is the notes are terrific, and every chapter ends with like more reading list, and it looked like a really good source for some other books that would go into various topics which would be of interest to us. So he says that most people either strongly believe that their religion is true, or if it's not true, that it's useful. Okay, some people will actually admit kind of, well, I don't know, but I find that this whole endeavor is useful. And so I wanted to talk to you about some specific arguments. There's about 8 of them that he gives, that people have given him of why they have their faith, and then sort of how you might respond to these different beliefs. Most importantly at all is the idea that you could actually just talk with people about your atheism. And I was talking to Stephen the other day, and I was saying, the first 100 times I said the word atheist, it just felt really uncomfortable, right? And so just to say, yeah, I'm an atheist. Hey, what do you believe? And here's what I believe. And so the idea that atheists could be evangelizing or proselytizing and trying to convert people to atheism, I think, is both frightening, because I tend to actually not like those people who sit down beside me and ask me, if I've been saved or whatever. But on the other hand, maybe it is actually what we need. So the first thing reason that people give for having their faith is that why is there all of this fantastic creation, the oceans and the mountains, and there must be a creator because there is this fantastic creation. And so what he says is to ask people the question of, so you're saying there because there is something in the universe, there must have been a creator. Yes. Well, why do you assume that nothing is the default, that there would have been nothing and then the creator created something? Why is it not more reasonable to believe that something always existed? And this is supposed to be a real mind blower for people. That moves them from having very strong faith to kind of doubting and questioning their faith. I'm not sure, and it's that doesn't feel like that works for me. These are the arguments that he says really worked well for him, right? And so that's one that really worked well for him. He says, definitely do not talk to people a lot about the facts of the origin of the universe, the Big Bang Theory, all of that. You just kind of get off onto a thing. And particularly if they have a closed doxology, they strongly believe in a very fundamentalist point of view, they're just not going to respond to that. And I have to take his word for it, because he's a crazy atheist guy who sits down next to people and tries to deconvert them, that argument doesn't work. But I know for me, the more that I learn about how the world actually works, the less I believe, crazy things like, in some possible way, God created the world and all of that. Okay, the next thing that people often say is, well, you can't prove that God doesn't exist. You can't prove that God doesn't exist. And there's all the forms of things like Bertrand Russell's tiny teapot. You can't prove that there's not a tiny teapot circulating in the universe. You can't prove that there's not unicorns on the dark side of the moon. The fact that you can't prove something is not good reason to believe that it does or doesn't exist. And basically that you can't, he says, well, what evidence would you accept to believe that God doesn't exist? And even to get them thinking about that will move them a little, like, what would it take for me to believe that God doesn't exist? And so, now here's one that I've heard. I guess it'd be interesting, like if you've heard these, just kind of like, this is one that I've heard. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Okay? And then he says, well, this is a misunderstanding of the word atheist, but I think it's a misunderstanding of the word faith, because faith is believing things that you don't have good evidence to believe, and so you don't actually need faith to be an atheist, because atheists simply don't believe in something that they don't have good reason to believe. He says that part of the reason that this has gained traction is because it starts from the idea that God does exist. And so it works in the same way when people are just beginning to doubt their faith, and then they go and they talk to their pastor, and the pastor says, pray on it. Well, if you are praying on it, to some extent you are already now putting yourself in the posture of kind of that the thing exists and is real. Okay. And my faith is true for me. My faith is true for me. And so part of the problem here, of course, is this like relativism, which actually I think relativism is one of those things that's really being taught as part of our culture, that we are encouraging people to accept that, it could be true for you and not true for you, right? And so he says, well, what about things like, if you believe that, we're all thetans trapped here on Earth, or the fact, obviously, that, like, people in ISIS believe, they have their beliefs. Like, the fact that it's true for me, even if it's not true for you, if you believe something crazy, that just doesn't make it true, right? And he says basically that's equivalent to saying, I prefer my delusions and I wish to remain with them. And so, but there's a similar thing to this, which is a little bit different, that I have heard people say to me, which is that it serves me. It works for me. Not even that it's true for me, but I'm willing to act as if it were true because it works for me, it serves me, right? And when I have been confronted with that argument in the past, what I basically said is, well, it doesn't serve me to believe things that I have no good evidence are true, or in fact that I even suspect are not true, right? Science can't explain quantum mechanics. Okay, so what's interesting is there is actually again, the fact that we can't explain something, does not, that has, what does that have to do with the existence of God? Again, like probably the more we could understand about quantum mechanics, the less we would be likely to think quantum mechanics equals proof of the existence of God, And Neil deGrasse Tyson says that if that is how you define your faith, then God becomes this shrinking thing God will recede as we become more scientifically knowledgeable. Okay, you have faith in science. To which I would just say, pretty much, yeah. But again, this is a misuse of the word faith, because faith is believing something you have no good reason to believe. And I have faith in love. And I have to say, for those of you who know Josh, who was one of the co-founders of the Seattle Atheist Church, so it was founded by 3 people. And recently I talked to Josh and I admitted that, I'm having some doubts because I believe in love. And God is love, so whatever. And to which he really did some fast street epistemology on me and just burst out laughing, which kind of, yeah. And so again, like, you believe in something that you have no reason to believe, and he goes into great evidence about great lengths. He was talking with Dawkins about this. Actually, Dawkins was being interviewed by somebody, and Dawkins says, well, he has evidence that his partner loves him because of all the little things that his partner does. And for me, I do believe that to a certain extent I have faith in my relationship, because I do believe in things unseen. I do believe in things unlikely. I believe that he would stand by me through thick and thin, and it might be it's just faith. Okay, and then life has no meaning without faith. That's another thing that I actually myself felt at some point. But what I meant by life has no meaning without faith is I really want to believe that someone has a plan and that it's all going to be okay, and no matter what's happening, it's all part of some higher purpose. I want to believe that. And that's what I meant by that's what gives life meaning, right? And so I had to start actually, I was very concerned originally when I became an atheist, because I was concerned about being an atheist parent and how much I wanted to give my children that certainty that there was a plan, that everything was okay because it was all part of some unfolding higher good, right? But what I realized was actually I should just kind of grow up and realize that no, unfortunately, some stuff that I do or that happens to me is just not good, and I need to figure out how to navigate life and make meaning out of life, make life meaningful. And so, and then finally, of course, without faith, society would devolve morally. And so what he's saying is, again, no facts. Just stick with that as their thesis and stick with how do you know it's true. So how do you know it's true? Do you know any people who are moral and good even if they don't believe in God? If he says no, well, can you imagine? What if your sister came and told you she doesn't believe in God? Would she still be a good person? How do you know a person is good even if they're doing all of those things and all of those kinds of things? But don't get into a conversation about how atheists actually know what is good, which is through discussions of secular ethics, right? Because they didn't get into this mess by being reasonable, and you can't necessarily reason them out of it. So says Peter Boghossian. He also says you're not going to get somebody to go on a scale of 1 to 7, 7 being absolute belief in their faith and 1 being no belief. You're not going to get somebody to just abandon their faith, right? So what's more likely is that they'll just move a little bit, have to go away and think about it. And I think for a lot of people, being an atheist is just not something they ever knew they were allowed to be. And that is why I want atheism to be called a religion, as much a religion as anything else, another worldview, if you will. And so when children are taught about religions, I would love them to be taught, and atheists. Atheists believe in that there's a natural explanation for the things that happen in the world, and they believe in secular ethics, that you can be good without God. And so in that sense, I love him for going around and talking to people about being an atheist. He takes great pains to say kindly, respectfully, all of that kind of thing. Possibly, maybe it's a good thing if there were an army of 25,000 street epistemologists. And so that's it. And so what I'd love for us to do is to now have a chance to talk about, do you talk about your atheism, with whom, under what circumstances, and how would you feel about this idea of being kind of he calls it a street epistemologist. And I think it's funny because I personally can't imagine myself ever trying to talk somebody out of their faith, God knows, not on a flight, where I mostly spend the whole time pretending to be asleep. And yet, of course, I'm here doing this, so I am in some sense taking that role. But Peter, you should just call yourself an atheist. I mean, if he can't call himself an atheist, then we definitely need to keep apart free thinkers, agnostics, skeptics, whatever you like to call yourself, Peter, you would be welcome here. So I'd like to end our sermon the way I always do, which is that atheists believe in good because good works in non-mysterious ways. Thank you.